All right. So we are in week 2 of our series on Hanukkah. I've titled this Got Milk. That will make sense when we get to the got milk portion, but up until then, I'm advertising for the U.S. dairy producers, I guess, during this. It will make sense, I promise. There is a reason for the milk reference, even though you don't tend to think of Maccabees as dealing with milk, but as dealing with oil, which I get. But we're not going to talk about the thing about the oil. That's last week. So this is really focused on what's called the Apocrypha in Protestant churches, which are books that didn't make it into the Tanakh, aren't really part of the New Testament, tend to make it into one or another version of the Catholic or Orthodox canonizations of the Bible. Much of what's in the Apocrypha is written in, or at least preserved in Greek. So all of the texts that we'll be looking at today really are preserved in Greek. We don't have them in Hebrew unless somebody's translated them from Greek into Hebrew. And this is true even of the ones that started out as Hebrew texts. So we're not going to hit all of these sources today, but we will hit more than half. So we'll be talking about 1, 2, 3, and 4, the first, second, third, and fourth books of Maccabees, each of which is in Greek. The first one was written in Hebrew. We don't really know dates for everything reliably. It's a lot of guesswork. We'll talk the least about Third Maccabees because Third Maccabees is in fact not about Hanukkah at all, but it deals with another revolt, and so people put the name Maccabees on that book at some point in its life, and it's not in the Catholic version of the Bible. It's only in some of the Orthodox ones. It's very rarely read in the Jewish world. But 1, 2, and first, second, and fourth, I'm going to call them occasionally 1, 2, and 4. If you recall, there was a thing about Trump saying 1 Kings or 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians or something at some point, and people laughed at him because it's first and second. I have to tell you, in the Biblical Scholarship Academy, people regularly say 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Maccabees and 4 Maccabees. So that was, to me, that was a nonsense criticism. Just shows that people don't hang around with biblical scholars enough to know that. I guess that's not really a knock on those folks for not hanging around with us. But 1, 2, 3, and 4 Maccabees. We won't look at antiquities today. We'll probably end up looking at that next week, but it's useful to know it's there because that's where the Maccabean Revolt is in Josephus's work, sort of historian. The Book of Judith, we don't actually know when the Book of Judith is from. We don't know what its original language was. We have it in Greek. And then the Scroll of Antiochus, we'll look at that next week as well. To the extent that the rabbis had historical documents that gave them any knowledge of the Maccabean Revolt, probably it was distilled into this Megillat Antiochus, the Scroll of Antiochus. It mostly is summarizing things from other places, so it's not so interesting for figuring out the history of the revolt. It is interesting in figuring out the history of how the rabbis and Jewish literature dealt with the Maccabean Revolt. So we'll look at it next week kind of for that purpose. So to recap what we did last week, we really focused on the rabbinic texts and Jewish law codes moving into the medieval and early modern period. And we said that the rabbi's original version in the Talmud is about the miracle of the oil, downplays the military stuff, but that the military aspects would reemerge as part of the official Hanukkah story by the 12th century, right? It's in Maimonides' law code, where he says, this is what Hanukkah is about. And he talks about military action by Judah Maccabee and all of that stuff. We looked at the practice of lighting a menorah and how that developed over time, and it wasn't really the normal thing that people did until the medieval period, that you were really kind of making things more elaborate by having a menorah than was the baseline commandment. And we talked about how the book of Daniel actually is telling the Hanukkah story, but nobody realized that because they just treated it as apocalyptic literature. But that Daniel, we can date Daniel because we know when the story goes wrong as it's telling it. And we talked about that women are accorded a special role during Hanukkah because of the story of Judith, and we kind of left it very abstract. We'll look at that more when we actually look at the book of Judith, which on its face is also not a Hanukkah story, but it's the history of its interpretation that really brings it into the Hanukkah orbit. So before we move on, are there questions left over from last week or that bubbled up?
Well, I have a fast one.
Sure.
So the Hanukkah menorah didn't become commonly used until recently, but was a menorah, a candelabrum, was that the symbol in ancient times of the nation of Israel?
Definitely by like the 1st century CE, because we do have the menorah on Bar Kokhba's coins. So from the 1st and 2nd century CE, it's definitely established as a Jewish symbol. It's harder to know before the Babylonian exile because there's no artwork and there are no pictures. So the menorah, the 7-branch menorah, is just not as common on older coins.
I saw it in a museum last summer on some ancient stone inscription, which wasn't Jewish. So I don't remember what it was, but anyway, thank you.
So it might have been on the Arch of Titus.
I think it is there too.
Yeah, so on it's on the Arch of Titus to kind of manufacture a military level of authenticity for the Emperor Titus, and shows the temple being destroyed and the menorah being taken out. That's a regular menorah as opposed to a Chanukiah, which is the 8+1 menorah that we use now. So the official history of Hanukkah is in 1st Maccabees. And what I mean by official history is very institutionally official history. And we'll see what that means in a bit. It seems fairly clear if you take 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees and you put them together, what happened seems relatively clear. Like the sequence of events seems relatively clear. The why for the particular kind of religious persecution that happened is not clear, because it's such a deviation from how ancient empires dealt with subject populations. So as we get to it, we'll then talk about why that's unusual. And it's worth noting that events are framed with reference to biblical predecessor stories. So you do have to read 1st and 2nd Maccabees in light of the fact that they're trying to grab onto some aspect of what's in the Bible as legitimizing the story or as prefiguring their stories in some ways. And we'll see how the different books of the Maccabees do that. So we'll start with, this is text on Tuesdays. There's a lot of text that is just pulled out and pasted in. If you buy a regular Tanakh, you are not going to find the books of the Maccabees in it. You usually have to buy a Christian Bible, and specifically sometimes a Catholic Bible, or one that says the Bible with Apocrypha or something like that, in order to have these books. The translation that I've used is the New Revised Standard Version translation, which was compiled by Protestant scholars, some Catholic scholars, some Jewish scholars. So it's in relatively common use in the academy. It's in relatively common use in mainline Protestant churches. though not in evangelical churches. They would not touch this with a 10-foot pole. And so we sort of know, we have a very small amount of information in First Maccabees, actually, about how the revolt starts. And basically starts with Alexander the Great. And it says, after Alexander came from Kittim, this is Greece, and had defeated Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, put to death the kings of the earth, advanced to the ends of the earth, plundered many nations. And when the earth became quiet, he was exalted, his heart lifted up. He gathered a strong army. They became tributes. And then he fell sick and knew he was dying. He summoned his most honored officers and divided the kingdom. And we actually talked about who these people were, Seleucus and Ptolemy and the other two who I never remember because they're not that important for the ancient Near East. The part of the ancient Near East I studied. These weren't that important. Cassander, and there's one other. Divides up his kingdom. Alexander only reigns 12 years. His officers rule in his place. From them, and it's just in the abstract, from those four came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome. We'll talk about what that means in a second. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, right? So they're just kind of lumping all the Greeks together. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, let's go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This is the rationale that First Maccabees says they had. Bad stuff has happened since we decided to be Jewish for real, so we should really just stop doing that. That's the rationale. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom and removed the marks of circumcision. We'll talk about what that means. And abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. They decided to behave like Greeks, and that was bad. That's what First Maccabees is telling us. So let's go back and unpack some of the stuff that was in here that wasn't necessarily so obvious. Number one, this word renegades. This is not a great translation. Or it's a translation chosen for readability, not for great direct translation of the underlying Greek. The underlying Greek here is actually anomoi. I could spell it in Greek, but what would that do for you? Anomoi is related to the word nomos. Nomos means law. So anomoi are not renegades, they are lawless ones. So even by the 2nd century BCE, Jews were defining themselves with regard to the law. And so if you were a renegade, what you were was a lawless one. You were rejecting the Torah from their perspective. So these are people who are rejecting the Torah. That's what the Greek is actually saying here. But it's a Protestant biblical translation, and they don't want to talk about the law stuff that much. So let's go make a covenant with the Gentiles. We separated them, proposal pleased them, eagerly went to the king who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So this is saying they went to talk to Antiochus, and Antiochus said, oh yeah, sure, you can do that. As though any Greek king was going to not give people permission to be Greek. That wasn't going to be a problem. But this is to wrap Antiochus up in the controversy. They built a gymnasium. A gymnasium is not, a gymnasium in Greek terminology is not a building with exercise machines, or it's not only a building with exercise machines. It is an exercise area where people exercise in the nude, but it is also the equivalent of a high school. So you will find in some countries that they call high school gymnasium. They got it from here. Not from this, but from Greek culture generally. So this is not just Greek exercise and behavior. This is Greek culture. This is, we're going to send our kids to school to be Greek and not Jewish. And remove the marks of circumcision. Okay, the word here is epispasm. EPI spasm. It is described in ancient sources as an attempt to literally reverse circumcision by recreating a foreskin from the remaining skin of a penis. So pulling it forward and weighting it and all kinds of other stuff to try to recreate a foreskin where one had been removed. It's hard to know whether this actually happened or whether this is just like a rumor or an accusation, but it's talked about in some sources, and so we kind of have to take it seriously. And abandon the Holy Covenant, right? So these are people who are really going, okay, we're going to be Greeks now. We're going to do exercise naked, and we're going to teach our children Greek and not teach them Torah. And we're going to try to undo circumcision so that when we're exercising naked in the gymnasium, we don't look any different from Greeks, right? This is the accusation. They joined the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So this is
Did you address the hostage part?
Oh, I forgot the hostage part. Yes. Okay. It says King Antiochus had been a hostage in Rome. It was fairly common for royal houses to ensure peace deals by sending their kids around to other royal houses. So Rome was really dominant in the western part of the Mediterranean. You didn't want to make an enemy of Rome at this point. So Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, whatever you want to call him, lived in Rome for a while with the there was no king in Rome at this point, so he's living with a senator probably or something like that. And it just helps secure a peace deal because everybody's got a hostage from everybody else. So that's what it means to be a hostage in Rome. This is not like he was kept in a dark room in shackles. He was essentially part of a senator's family. So it's not hostage like dark room, blindfold, handcuffs. It's different. It's wardship as much as it is anything else. So it's likely that Antiochus would have spoken Latin as well. So Antiochus comes, people get Antiochus to let them be Greek, as though he would say no. We learned last week that Antiochus invaded Egypt twice. So this after subduing Egypt is his first invasion of Egypt. So after the first one, he went up against Israel, entered the sanctuary, took the altar, took the lampstand and the light, the menorah, and all its utensils, and he took the table for the bread of the presence, cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtains, the crowns, the gold decoration on the front of the temple, and stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels, and he took the treasures that he found, and then went to his own land. Because he'd been told that there was a whole bunch of money hanging around, and he had just fought a war, so he wanted the stuff to be able to pay war debt. If this sounds like we're verging on something vaguely sounding like the Revolutionary War, you're right. No taxation without representation. Well, okay, he just took all the stuff out of the temple, which obviously is bad from their perspective. 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words, and they believed him, right? So he kind of lulls them into a false sense of security, and then he attacks the city, kills lots of people, plunders it, burns it, tears the houses down, takes women and children and livestock, and then fortifies the city of David with a strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. So the story here is essentially they take Jerusalem, and then they build another wall around it in order to be able to defend it against Jews who might try to get back in. They station there a sinful people, men who are renegades. Again, anomoi, right? This is basically saying there were a lot of Jews who apparently wanted to be Greek. And so they joined up and defended the citadel and joined in with Antiochus's army. These strengthened their position, stored up arms and food, collected the spoils, and became a great menace. This, we're going to discover that First Maccabees is essentially probably a court history of the early years of the Hasmoneans. So this is the whole book of First Maccabees covers probably 30 or 40 years worth of time for this family that eventually becomes the last set of kings in Israel. And they start as religious fundamentalists, essentially. And so they're going to characterize their opponents as being rebels and lawless and whatever else. And this is part of it, is to say that they wanted to be Greek and we were opposed to them. And so they joined up. It's not really clear how many people are really involved in this, how many Jews are really involved in this. We don't really know. But the idea that they might have been able to form an army suggests that a lot of people wanted to be Greek. That given the opportunity to choose, a lot of people didn't want to remain people who worshiped a single god at a temple because there was another way of being and they liked it better. But we don't really know the numbers. And there are a lot of hypotheses about why all of this stuff might have happened, including one scholar of the period who suggests that actually what's going on is an example of Reform versus Orthodox Judaism. So that the people who were opposed to the Maccabees were precursors to Reform Judaism. Because they wanted to be Jewish, but they wanted to look Greek. This is his supposition. There's also all kinds of other weird suppositions. And the problem is we just don't have a lot of documents. So it's really hard to know. But this is the story, that they turned against the other Jews and they helped build up this citadel around Jerusalem. And I'm sorry, I know the text gets small here. Then the king wrote that everybody should be one people. Everybody should be one people, should give up their customs. Gentiles accepted command of the king. Many from Israel gladly adopted his religion, and they sacrificed to idols. And the king sends out and tells everybody in all the villages, start being Greek, start following the Greek religion. On the 15th day of Kislev, Hanukkah's on the 25th day of Kislev, so we're getting close to the date for Hanukkah. On the 15th day of Kislev, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. We saw this same phrase last week. The book of Daniel used it to talk about a desolating sacrilege or abomination on the altar. So everybody's using this phrase. They built altars around in the surrounding towns of Judah. Remember, you don't get to sacrifice anywhere but the temple, so building altars around the country is bad. Offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. They tore up the law anywhere they found it. Anyone possessing the book of the covenant or adhered to the law was condemned to death. They kept using violence. And then on the 25th day of the month, 25th day of Kislev, this is the date on which Hanukkah begins in the modern Jewish calendar. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. So on the 15th day of that month, they profaned the temple. On the 25th day of the month, they actually offer a sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. And that is why Hanukkah is on the 25th day of Kislev in the Jewish calendar, because you undo it on the same day that they did it. According to the decree, they put to death the women and the children who were circumcised and who had their children circumcised, families and those who circumcised them, hung the infants from their mothers' necks. The ancient Greek world was not kind. I mean, we like to think of them as highly educated and rational. Don't buy that. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved not to eat unclean food, and they chose to die. And they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. Okay, so we're getting the fuller background here. The king's officers who were enforcing it came to the town of Modi'in, and now we have a name that maybe sounds familiar because this is where Judah Maccabee is from, and wanted them to make sacrifice. And they came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. And the king's officer spoke to Mattathias, "You are a leader, honored and great in this town, supported by sons and brothers. Be the first to come and do what the king commands," which is to say, offer a sacrifice to a Greek god. And Mattathias says, "Nope. Even if all the nations under the king obey him, I will not be doing that. We will live by the covenant. We will not desert it. We will not obey the king's words." When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar of Modi'in. When Mattathias saw that, zeal burned and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to his righteous anger, and he went and killed the guy. Thus begins the Maccabean Revolt, according to 1st Maccabees. At the same time, he killed the king's officer. Mattathias is an old guy, by the way. So, he has a number of adult sons at this point. So you have to wonder if this actually happened. At the same time, he killed the king's officer. He burned for the zeal of the law, just as Phinehas had against Zimri, son of Salu. Okay, you are excused if you don't know what's going on here. So I'll finish this next verse, and then I'll explain what's going on there. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his sons fled for the hills and left all they had in the town. Okay, Phinehas is one of the second generation of priests recorded in the Book of Numbers. So the Kohanim. So if we're going from Moses, Moses has a brother named Aaron. Aaron has sons. His sons have sons. Phinehas is descended from Aaron. So he's one of the priests in the tabernacle in the wilderness, according to the Torah. And there is a fight breaks out, and Zimri has married somebody who's not Jewish, who's not an Israelite, and Phinehas just kind of spontaneously, in response to a blasphemy, just kind of runs the guy through with a spear. So he burned with zeal for the law as Phinehas did. This is comparing Mattathias as having the same merit as a priest who spontaneously kills somebody in the Book of Numbers. And the priest is praised in the Book of Numbers for doing this. So we're making a real direct call out to saying Mattathias is like that guy, which means he's really good from the perspective of 1st Maccabees. So we're getting this, okay, we get it. Mattathias is opposed to all of this, the idea of Hellenizing, of becoming Greek. And we're starting to see 1st Maccabees make really direct connections to prior biblical texts, which helps to legitimize the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. So let's all leave town, and he doesn't say this, but we'll go fight a guerrilla war. That's basically what happens here. We haven't seen too much of it. We'll see it in just a minute. 1st Maccabees actually kind of juxtaposes narrative and poetic sections, particularly in its first 4 or 5 chapters. It's initially really common. So you'll get 5 or 6 verses of prose, and then you'll get 3 or 4 verses of poetry, and then you'll switch back and forth for a while. And it tends to be a restatement of what came before, just a poetic version of what happened before. This is on purpose. This does 2 things. One, using the form of poetry of a lament, it connects the profaning of the temple to the destruction in 587 that creates the Babylonian exile, right? You're writing, if you have kind of the same language, the same kind of language, the same kind of lament, it's intended to make the reader kind of go, oh, it's the same thing. The other thing that it does is when it copies the Psalms, it's comparing the Maccabees to David and legitimizes the Maccabees as not a full replacement of David as king, but having the same qualities. Because there's lots of Psalms for David, so there's lots of Psalms in First Maccabees for the Maccabees. And we can get an example of what this looks like. So we looked at this text already, this after subduing Egypt, Antiochus strips the temple, and then we get a restatement. He shed blood, he spoke with arrogance, Israel mourned deeply, rulers and elders groaned, young women and men became faint, the beauty of women faded, every bridegroom took up the lament, she who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning, even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all house of Jacob was clothed with shame. This is language that's pulled out of Lamentations. So it's a very direct, oh, I can see the parallels here for the reader who already knows the Book of Lamentations, which is kind of the assumption that you do. So we can actually compare. This is attributed to Mattathias during his rebellion, and this is from the Book of Lamentations. So why was I born to see this? The ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city. The Lord has scorned his altar and disowned his sanctuary. And so you can see her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into exile. Her gates have sunken into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Right? So you can see as you go through that they're copying the ideas. This is First Maccabees. This is Lamentations. And so you can see we're grabbing ideas from Lamentations and pulling them into Maccabees and duplicating literary forms in order to make this as bad seeming, which means that the Maccabees are heroic because they fix this. To go back to, so Nadine mentions that there's an indication that the same person wrote this. We're talking about burning for the zeal of the law as Pinchas did, this part here. Probably not the same person, but this person was definitely knew Numbers and used the story from Numbers to make people make that connection. And that's part of how First Maccabees works, is lots and lots and lots of stuff that refers back to other biblical texts, because the reader expects his audience knows those things and wants them to make a connection that these people are as good as the people in Numbers or David or whoever. So this is kind of the comparison in literary form. So this has all been First Maccabees. I should say First Maccabees is much longer than the slides. In fact, First Maccabees is almost 20 chapters long. Much of it deals with stuff that happens way after the Maccabean Revolt. So the Maccabean Revolt up through the events that we consider to feed the holiday of Hanukkah finishes up around chapter 5 or 6 in First Maccabees. There's another 14 chapters to go, because it then chronicles out about another 25, 30 years of what the Maccabees do. Judah Maccabee dies in like chapter 6. And then we've got more generations of Maccabees and their doings, their invasion of the neighboring lands and all kinds of other things. So that's the end of our First Maccabees part. Notice I've managed to say first instead of 1 Maccabees. Questions about First Maccabees? Jack.
So there's a sequence here that is a little puzzling about Antiochus.
Yes.
Antiochus. So first there's the, sure, you want to be Greek? Be Greek. And then there's a little, looting, normal stuff. Then there's this, nope, everybody must abandon covenant practice. Everybody must follow Greek religious practice. Those are different things than the sort of permissive, yeah, you want to be Greek. So is there any explanation for what about this change?
There's more detail in Second Maccabees than in First. So First Maccabees is actually not a very detailed account of things. And so it's a little vague. I haven't skipped a lot of verses. You kind of get, yeah, be Greek, there's some looting, and then all of a sudden there's a, oh, well, you're giving my people a hard time. Fine. I'm just going to lay down the law on everybody. And it's not really clear why. There's more detail in Second Maccabees, and the timeline gets fleshed out a lot more in Second Maccabees. So you kind of get a sense that in the first chapter or so of First Maccabees, that's all occurring over like a 3 or 4 year period in the run-up to the profaning of the temple. And it gets all collapsed into like a single chapter of text. Second Maccabees, which we'll see in a moment, actually goes into much greater depth, and you understand more about what happened. You get names that go with events and people, and it becomes much more detailed, and you start to at least understand that there were a lot of problems that eventually resulted in Antiochus's intervention. It does need to be said that Antiochus's intervention is a very strange one from a Greco-Roman perspective, because Greek rulers did not really tend to care very much what people did religiously. They were very uninclined to say, okay, everybody has to be Greek and stop worshiping your gods. They didn't care. Pay your taxes. That's really what it boiled down to for most Greek and Roman rulers. Pay your taxes. We just don't care. In the ancient world, there was respect for old stuff, and people recognized Judaism was old. And so there was no inclination to tell people stop being Jewish. So either Antiochus got really mad, or Antiochus became a megalomaniac. I mean, there really aren't a lot of options. One of the big problems we still have with doing Jewish history in this time period is that almost the only information we have about any of this are from Jewish writers. So everything is from a Jewish perspective. It's not as though Gentile writers were very concerned about what was happening in this part of the world. And so we don't have somebody like, if you've heard of Greco-Roman historians, you've heard of folks like Herodotus or Thucydides, who were writing about, well, so Thucydides was writing about the Peloponnesian War as an Athenian. Herodotus, I think it's fair to say that Herodotus didn't know what the hell he was talking about when he wrote about any of it. But it was like really superficial travel journalism. He kind of was, I went all over the Mediterranean, and let me tell you about what Egyptian religion is, and let me tell you about what Jewish religion. He has no idea what he's talking about. Like, when you start to dig into his details, you kind of have to go, oh yeah, Herodotus was like the ugly American, interpreting things to be what he thought they were. But we don't even have that. All we have are Jewish sources. So we don't have an official court history from Antiochus that says, oh, well, this is what I was thinking. We don't have that. We just have Jewish sources who decided that Antiochus hated Jews and decided that there shouldn't be Judaism anymore. So we have no insight other than the books of Maccabees and Josephus, who seems to be mostly copying First Maccabees. So Larry, and then
I have two fast questions, sort of related. At some point, Jews began to celebrate Hanukkah, and they told some story, whether it involved a revolt or a miracle or oil or whatever. Was that before the books of Maccabees were written, or Do we know when that started? And the second question is, why didn't the Book of Maccabees get into the Tanakh? Was it too late, too historical? In other words, what's before all of this?
So probably to answer the second question first, which okay, so I answer questions chiastically, sorry. So it's probably too late for stuff to be added in by the time the Book of Maccabees, the first Book of Maccabees is written. The first Book of Maccabees cannot have been written earlier than about 125 BCE, at which point the biblical canon is basically formed. And we know it's basically formed because everything but Esther is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know that this book is referring to all of these other books. So there's already a canon that's been formed. It's not preserved in Hebrew, even though it was originally written in Hebrew. There are linguistic things about the Greek that tell you that it came from Hebrew. It didn't get preserved in Hebrew, so it clearly wasn't important to later generations of Hebrew readers. But it must have been important to Greek readers outside the land of Israel. It's not 100% clear when celebration of Hanukkah started. First Maccabees says that people continued to celebrate it in the first year after the temple was rededicated. So you had a rededication, and then a year later, people came back and did it again. Second Maccabees, it's probably worth popping over to that section for a moment. Second Maccabees starts with several letters, like correspondence. And the second of these letters starts off by talking about how, in light of the fact that you're about to celebrate Sukkot on the 25th day of Kislev, out in the diaspora, we're writing this stuff to you now so that you have the full history of the holiday, which suggests all kinds of things about Hanukkah that we haven't gotten to yet. Like maybe Hanukkah is a substitute for Sukkot. Second Maccabees is dated to probably the 1st century BCE. So definitely by then people are doing Hanukkah, and they're doing it in Israel and they're doing it outside of Israel. So definitely by the Roman period, people are doing Hanukkah. Probably before that. So Nadine, you have a microphone on.
Can you go back to the two provisions, the two
Mhm.
that are similar? Okay. So I'm being hyperliteral, of course.
Mhm.
The one on the right is from Lamentations, and that blames the Lord for the damage.
Mhm.
The one on the left blames the Greeks, the Gentiles.
Yes.
So are we talking about the same destruction? And is there a reason why one of them, and if so, one of them blames the Gentiles and one of them blames the Lord?
So it's not the same act of destruction. So the stuff on the right in Lamentations is from 587 BCE, is describing events from 587 BCE. The stuff on the left from the Book of Maccabees is describing 167, 166 BCE. So there's a 500-year gap, 400-year gap. But what this is doing is it's emulating the style and comparing, the destruction of the holy city here with that one, right? And it doesn't draw exact parallels because they know they can't do that. So they pull short of saying, this is divine punishment on Israel. But by using the literary style and making those kind of, those who know will know, references to things that are already in the Tanakh, they're drawing historical parallels for the reader to say, this is like oh, this is like, oh, this is like, so that you make, so they're creating the historiography for you to say, oh, well, this is like the destruction of the temple. These Maccabees, they're like David, by using a psalm type format to praise them. That's kind of what's happening here. Is it's not that history repeats, it's that it rhymes. And this is them rhyming.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was all First Maccabees. There are commentary series available for First and Second Maccabees, and each of the volumes is, 700 pages long. I know the author's brother. I don't know the author. Because the author's brother was my rabbi when I lived in Tallahassee. From a long line of rabbis, the Goldsteins, and Jonathan Goldstein became a professor and studied the Maccabees, and his brother became a congregational rabbi. So this is Second Maccabees. This has a lot more detail on events. And this is where we maybe have a sense for what actually happens. First Maccabees started us with Alexander the Great. Remember, oh, Alexander the Great dies and he designates these generals. And Second Maccabees starts with a pair of letters. The first letter talks about the first temple, the Nehemiah, who's Ezra and Nehemiah are generally regarded as having rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem after its destruction. So around the year 400 BCE, including the origin of naphtha. If you are unfamiliar with naphtha, but you are familiar with napalm, naphtha is ancient napalm. It is a petroleum-based jelly that you could light on fire and would stick to stuff and burn down ships. And basically it says when the temple was about to be destroyed, they took some fire from the altar and they stuck it in a jar and they hid it away. And when Nehemiah went to rededicate the temple, he grabbed this jar of fire, but what there was liquid that lit on fire really quickly. And then he gathered it up back again, the liquid, after he was done. And the text says that it was purified, nephather in Hebrew, but everybody calls it naphtha. And it's petroleum jelly that you light on fire. So this was used in ancient hand grenades. This is how ships did battle in the ancient Mediterranean. It was they would fling this stuff on fire at each other and try to burn the other ship down. So this is how Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated in the naval battle at Actium, and around the year 50 was this ancient napalm was thrown on their ships. So now you know what happened to Antony and Cleopatra, why they lost. So apparently Nehemiah discovered naphtha. Naphtha was from the fire on the altar of the first temple, according to Second Maccabees. I'm not saying that's real. I'm saying that's what they said. There's a story about Jeremiah before the destruction of the first temple hiding the ark and other items in a cave. So we're now going way back into like first temple times to try to connect the temple to this time period. We have no idea if any of this is like true. And then we have a long preface that says, oh, by the way, I'm just basing this. This is like the Reader's Digest condensed version of a 5-volume work. If you really want to know about all the details, go read that. But we're going to send this to you. We're sending this to you. The conceit is I'm writing to you from Israel and I'm sending it to you in Egypt. So I can't send you 5 volumes, but I'll send you this one scroll. We don't know what happened to this original work, this thing by Jason of Cyrene. I mean, we don't know. It probably existed, but who knows? But this is still more detailed than First Maccabees will have been. So Second Maccabees gives us a lot more about how the revolt started, and it says, while the holy city was inhabited in unbroken peace and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of wickedness, it came about that the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple, even to the extent that King Seleucus, this is Antiochus's almost immediate predecessor, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses connected with the service of the sacrifices. The Greeks honored Jews so much that they subsidized the operation of the temple in Jerusalem. Until one day, Simon of the tribe of Benjamin, who had been made captain of the temple, so he's like captain of the guard, he's not a priest, had a disagreement with the high priest about administering the city market. He could not prevail over Onias because Onias was the high priest, so instead he went to Apollonius of Tarsus, who was the governor of Syria and Phoenicia. Okay, Syria is mostly Lebanon, and Phoenicia is the other parts of the land of Israel that aren't Judea. So basically, I don't agree with the priest, so I'm going to go tell the Greek ruler of this area what happened. And said the treasury in Jerusalem was full of money, so much that you couldn't figure it out, so you should go get it from them. Because you need money to wage wars, right? Why don't you go take money from the temple? Trying to get Onias deposed. Apollonius met the king, told him about the money. The king chose Heliodorus, a general who was in charge, and sent him to go get the money from the temple. Heliodorus sets out on his journey to make an inspection of the cities of Syria and Phoenicia, but really, he wasn't doing that. He was going to raid the temple in Jerusalem. So we're now getting a lot more detail about what happened initially, which is there's a political dispute, and rather than let it sit, somebody went and told the Greeks, I don't like what you're doing in the market. I'm going to go tell Dad. And Dad said, well, if I can't trust either of you with it, I'm going to take it myself. Right? If you can't cooperate and play carefully and share your toy, I'm going to take your toy. That's what happens. But Onias and the people start praying, and Heliodorus tried to take stuff from the temple, but when he arrived at the treasury, the sovereign of spirits and of all authority caused so great a manifestation that all who had been so bold as to accompany him were astounded by the power of God and became faint with terror. For there appeared to them a magnificently caparisoned horse, armored, an armored horse with a rider of frightening mien. It rushed furiously at Heliodorus and struck at him with its front hooves. Its rider was seen to have armor and weapons of gold. 2 young men also appeared, remarkably strong, gloriously beautiful, splendidly dressed, who stood on either side of him and flogged him continuously. When he fell to the ground and deep darkness came over him, his men took him up, put him on a stretcher, and carried him away. This man who had just entered the treasury with a great retinue and all his bodyguard was now unable to help himself, and they clearly recognized the sovereign power of God. In other words, a bunch of angels appeared in armor and afflicted this Greek general, and then they disappeared again. So Second Maccabees is already way weirder because God's sending mystical figures to kill people, which does not happen in First Maccabees, by the way. There are no apparitions that go chasing people around, but we have it in Second Maccabees. So to recap, because this already is a lot more weird detail, Antiochus's predecessor sends Heliodorus to settle a dispute by taking the toy away, essentially. Some divine intervention happened and changes Heliodorus's mind. Heliodorus actually has like a conversion story in Second Maccabees, After this is all over, he goes back to the royal court and he says, listen, here's what happened. I tried to take the money, and instead I got attacked by these like spectral figures. Don't mess with these people, because as long as they follow all the rules, God's going to protect them. So just leave them alone. Onias has still been a high priest during all of this. Simon has tried to bribe Seleucus. Doesn't work because God intervenes. That's the story here in the text. This is already way weirder than anything that was in First Maccabees. By the time we get to this point in the book in First Maccabees, because we're now 3.5 chapters in, First Maccabees is almost done with the Maccabean Revolt by this point. So we get way more detail about who the people are. So we get a lot more clarity. Okay, the first king tried to do this, tried to take the money because there was a political dispute, and instead that didn't work, and people continued to honor. Okay, so we got it. Way more detail already. Helps to kind of sort out the vague, what happened with this persecution thing? What was that about? We haven't gotten there yet. We've got so much detail. Seleucus dies, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom. Jason, Onias's brother, obtains the high priesthood by corruption, basically going to Antiochus and saying, Onias is holding out on you again with money. And Antiochus then said, oh, great. You be high priest and get me the money. So he promised to pay all of this extra revenue and establish a gymnasium and students for it and enroll the people of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. In other words, make them Greek as opposed to Jews. And the king said, okay. And Jason got a bunch of people to convert. We're in 2 Maccabees 4. By 1 Maccabees 4, the revolt's almost over. So this is how different the detail level is. And it says, Jason took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. It's not clear what a Greek hat is. We don't have pictures. It's obvious that they're not wearing kippot. I guess we can say that part. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar, despising the sanctuary, neglecting the sacrifices. They hurried to take part in the wrestling arena and discus throwing and disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors, the Torah, and putting the highest value on Greek forms of prestige, and for this reason, disaster overtook them. Jason kicks his brother Onias out. Onias was the good guy. Jason drags everybody down with him. Disaster overtook them. In other words, God punished them. That's what's happening in 2 Maccabees. We're getting much more direct play in history as opposed to at one point when Antiochus dies in 1 Maccabees, he says something like, oh, it's better to follow the law than to try to mess with God. And then he dies. In 2 Maccabees, God is intervening routinely, sending spectral figures and punishing the entire nation. And the theology is way more on top here than it is in 1 Maccabees. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of Simon, the guy who called the cops in the first place, to carry money to the king. But Menelaus, when presented to the king, extolled him with an air of authority and secured the priesthood for himself. Menelaus is not a Kohen. He's now high priest. That's where the story has gone. So Jason was at least the brother of the high priest and was eligible to be high priest. Menelaus is not. Notice Menelaus is not a Hebrew name. Menelaus is a Greek name. It's possible that the guy's Hebrew name was Menachem or something like that, but who knows? But in any case, he replaces Jason as high priest. After receiving the orders, he returned, no qualification for the high priesthood, but having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. You got the king behind you. What are they going to do? So Jason, who was supplanted by another man, was driven as a fugitive into the land of Ammon, so Jordan. Though Menelaus continued to hold office, he didn't actually pay any of the money he promised because it wasn't there. So when the captain of the citadel kept requesting payment, they were summoned by the king. Menelaus left his brother Lysimachus as deputy. So Stratus left Crates, this commander of the Cyprian troops, so they disappear. We can't pay the taxes, we're going to go away. But we no longer have somebody who's qualified to be a priest being a priest. That's the upshot of this part of the story. About this time, this is a little while longer, Antiochus invades Egypt again. For almost 40 days, there appeared over the city golden-clad cavalry charging through the air and companies fully armed with lances and swords, and everyone prayed the apparition might have a good omen. When a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, so Antiochus's invasion of the south didn't succeed. This was the second one. We talked about last week how his first one went okay and his second one failed because the Romans sort of intervened. But he thought Antiochus was dead, and so Jason, who was Onias's brother who became priest when he shouldn't have, but was at least a priest, took soldiers and attacked the city, but actually it didn't work. And in the end, he got disgraced from his conspiracy and fled again to Jordan. So, up another political dispute. We're getting way more into the weeds on the story, but it also helps clarify what was going on. When news of everything happened to reach the king, Jason tried to take it again, and it didn't happen. He took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. Raging inwardly, he left Egypt and invaded the city, massacred lots and lots of people. Not content, he entered the temple, took the stuff out of the temple, didn't realize that God was angry for a little while because the people who lived in the city were not being good people to begin with, so he was enabled to invade the temple according to 2 Maccabees because the people living in Jerusalem were bad. So they were involved in sins, but if they hadn't been, this wouldn't have happened. But the Lord did not choose the nation for the sake of the holy place, and what was forsaken in the wrath of the Almighty was restored again when the Lord became reconciled. We still actually haven't gotten to Antiochus saying, don't be Jewish. The Maccabean Revolt is over in 1 Maccabees by this point in the book. So this is the level of the difference in the detail. So we know this is the second invasion. Antiochus has raided the temple. He's got a collaborator. Antiochus carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hurried away to Antioch, thinking he could sail on the land and walk on the sea. He left governors to oppress the people. And besides these Menelaus, who stuck around, and his malice toward Jewish citizens, he sent Apollonius with an army of 22,000, commanded him to kill the men and sell the women and boys as slaves. Again, he tricked them, rushed into the city, and Judas Maccabeus with 9 others got away to the wilderness. Notice that it doesn't say he was in Modein, which is where we are used to thinking that Judah Maccabee is from. He seems to have left Jerusalem with 9 others. Assume they're his brothers. No mention of his father. Mattathias is not in this story. They continued to live on what grew wild so they might not share in the defilement. Okay, we can't eat meat, we can't do this, we can't do that, so we're going to have to forage. Okay, so before we kind of fix everything, are there questions about how all of this seems to start in 2 Maccabees? Other than, wow, there's a lot more detail, and how did you keep track of that? Which is a fair question. My answer is grad school. Okay, so we'll use the next section, which tries to sort some of these issues out a little bit. So where First and Maccabees meet or don't, Judah Maccabees in both. So we can presume he's a real figure. We don't really know about his father. His father's only in First Maccabees. Religious oppression is noted in both. Some level of Jewish Hellenizing collaboration is in both, right? So there's some level of there are Jews fighting with each other, and then the Greeks are involved because one or the other side pulls them in. There's a sense of connection with a more distant past that has some relevance to the present, right? So First Maccabees starts by talking about Alexander and keeps citing biblical passages. Second Maccabees doesn't do that as much, but it says that Nehemiah invented naphtha, which I don't know about that, or at least that naphtha came from the temple originally. Jeremiah hid the items that went in the temple, and the ark still hidden to this day, supposedly. Everybody's connected to the past somehow. Second Maccabees says that Judah Maccabee assembles an army, but we never see Mattathias appear. He just doesn't come up. Second Maccabees ties events to divine action, right? There's this story about mystical figures attacking a Greek general in the temple. There will be another one that details why and how Antiochus dies, and basically God makes him sick in Second Maccabees. First Maccabees doesn't talk about religion a lot. It uses references to biblical stories. It creates poems that are like other biblical texts, but it doesn't put its theology out there. Whereas Second Maccabees says the people were bad, and that's why Antiochus was allowed to do what he did. But that doesn't stay. And as soon as the people become reconciled, God punishes Antiochus. I mean, that's how Second Maccabees is going to go. First Maccabees just kind of mentions stuff a little bit, but really it's all human action in First Maccabees. First Maccabees focuses on official court history, fuzzier on the details, not as inclined to blame other Jews too specifically. It doesn't even name the people who are fighting with each other. Right? Second Maccabees said, oh, there's Onias, and there's Jason, and there's Menelaus, and there's, Lysimachus, and it starts naming people. And First Maccabees doesn't get into the weeds, presumably because some of the people that it would have to name are people who are still important to the royal court at the time. Because First Maccabees is going to talk about all of these Maccabee brothers and make them look like very good people, because it's trying to rewrite history. This is a priestly family that becomes a king, and that hadn't been the pattern. So it has to rewrite history a little bit to make these guys look better than maybe they were. And we know that they turn out to be really awful because the rabbis tell us that. Roberto.
Hi. So this the Maccabees are really, I think the dynasty is really the Hashmonaim, right? So that's kind of what the family was. So at what point they start this nomenclature of Maccabee and they start being called Maccabees? That part of the description of the book explaining why they become the Maccabees, that brand.
So there's never a great explanation given in First and Second Maccabees. It just sort of starts saying Judah, who was called Maccabee. And everybody just knows that he was Judah, who was called Maccabee. The rabbis have an explanation, right? And their explanation is, well, because he used a hammer, so Maccabee means he's the hammerer. But that's the rabbis. That's not actually in these books, who just kind of say Maccabee. And they also say Hasmonean. They do name the family, but they just kind of take the name for granted. And almost as soon as Judas appears the first time, you get the name Maccabee.
And another question. So those books, and I don't know if maybe I missed, but so we have those different versions of the story, right? It's pretty much kind of the same story, or the same periods. It's not a sequence, right? 1 and 2, you would think it's a sequence, but it's like
Right.
the same story is being retold on a very different way.
Yeah.
So do we have any ideas? Are those Jews that were writing this story? We know that, or we think that, or what is kind of the motivation of someone to write this?
Yeah. So the first Maccabees, in its Greek translation, because that's the only way we have it is in Greek, has lots of little linguistic turns that indicate that it was originally written in Hebrew. It's these turns of phrase, and there are things that are in there that make you go, this wasn't really originally in Greek. So this is definitely a Jewish author, because nobody else was writing in Hebrew. It's definitely a Jewish author, and it's a Jewish author who's trying to shore up the legitimacy of the Hasmoneans. So the Hasmoneans always come off really well, and they're compared to David, and their situation is compared to the destruction of Jerusalem the first time around, and they're made out to be pretty heroic. So it's a court history, essentially. It's somebody who's shoring up those kings. Second Maccabees almost certainly was also written by Jews. It opens with a letter that I didn't quote, but the letter basically says, "Hey, I'm writing to you from Jerusalem. I see you're in Egypt. We know that you're about to celebrate the Feast of Booths on the 25th of Kislev," which isn't right. You celebrate Sukkot on the 15th day of Tishrei, right? 15 days after Rosh Hashanah. So we know they're celebrating Hanukkah, and it seems like they're celebrating Hanukkah in kind of the same way they would have celebrated Sukkot. So we know that you're doing this, so we want to make sure you have the story so that you know what actually happened. And its story is more detailed and is more overtly theological, to get across the follow the Torah or else things go bad kind of message. So these are both definitely Jewish works. There is a book called Third Maccabees. It's not clear when Third Maccabees was written. It describes events that happen in the diaspora. Its plot isn't connected to any of these. There are at least some scholars who think it might be a Christian work. It doesn't talk about Jesus. It doesn't talk about Christian theology, but there are some scholars who think maybe this is a Christian work. But because it's not really about the Hanukkah story, we're not going to touch it other than to say, yeah, there's this other book out there. It's got elephants. I mean, it has some Greek war elephants in it as a trivia item. But it's an event. It happens in a city in the diaspora. It should be around 120 BCE, but it's not really connected to the Maccabean Revolt. But it's a Jewish revolt, and so they slapped Maccabees as a title on it. Or maybe Jerome, some Christian scribes slapped Maccabees on it, probably, as a title. So yeah, First and Second Maccabees overlap in terms of what they're describing, different levels of detail, different theological twists, and different literary approaches. And, Second Maccabees isn't really trying to make the argument that this is just like the destruction of the temple, for example. But First Maccabees does. So we've talked about this. There's something in Second Maccabees that doesn't appear in First Maccabees, which are martyrdom stories. So it talks about someone named Eleazar the scribe, and it talks about a woman and her 7 sons that will willingly become martyrs rather than eat non-kosher food or sacrifice to a Greek god. And you can, this, you know, this is a few verses. This is a chapter. But it's a lot more time with individual people than First Maccabees really spends. Because First Maccabees covers like 30, 40 years of time. But there's a book called Fourth Maccabees. We talked about Third Maccabees and said, not really relevant to Hanukkah, but Fourth Maccabees is. Fourth Maccabees is about Eleazar the scribe and the woman and her 7 sons. That is its primary subject matter. So it goes even farther into small details from the Hanukkah story. And then there's the Book of Judith, which isn't about Hanukkah, except it is, which is a weird way of saying it. It's kind of like Daniel wasn't about Hanukkah, except it is. So in Fourth Maccabees, opens with, the subject I'm about to discuss is most philosophical, whether devout reason is sovereign over the emotions, which is really not a great translation. What it really means to say is whether devout reason is the absolute master over emotions. The subject is essential to everyone seeking knowledge. Basically, what's about to happen is Fourth Maccabees is going to say that reason, religious reason, beats your emotions, and so you should follow religious reason, even if it means becoming a martyr. And so it spends most of its content talking about Eleazar willingly dying and a woman and her sons is willingly dying. And it puts into Eleazar's mouth this speech. Even if, as you suppose, our law were not truly divine and we wrongly held it to be divine, not even so would it be right for us to invalidate our reputation for piety. Don't suppose it would be a petty sin if we were to eat defiling food to transgress the law. You scoff at our philosophy as though living by it were irrational, but it teaches us self-control so that we master our pleasures and desires, and it trains us to courage so we endure any suffering willingly. In other words, Fourth Maccabees is actually a Jewish book about Stoic philosophy and uses specific stories from Second Maccabees to tell the story, to make its argument by creating speeches that it puts into the characters' mouths. Because nobody knows who these people are. There aren't names. We just have these stories. It's really common in the ancient world for this to happen. So if you've heard the stories about Masada, where the stories about Masada that we have, by the way, are from Josephus, who's a Greco-Roman writer. And Josephus says, oh, well, they're in Masada and the Romans are coming, and so they agree to kill each other. And there's a big speech that their leader gives. But nobody survived. So how does he know what the speech was? He says, oh, a couple of girls got away and they told me. Really? It was really common in the ancient world for people to invent speeches for their characters. And that's what's happened in Fourth Maccabees. Stoic philosophy, I'm going to put these speeches in the mouths of the characters. So if you've ever had to read Plato and you have all these characters in Plato that are giving these speeches, I really hate to tell you that those people didn't say those things. Plato made it all up. He may have talked to Socrates and Socrates said, can you believe what that idiot Crito said? Crito said blah, 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 blah. Plato wrote the whole thing. These things are written and put into somebody's mouth to convey a message about reason as opposed to emotion, stoicism as compatible with being Jewish, which, by the way, is probably what the rabbis were in part 2, was Stoics. Jack. Oh, you're muted.
Go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
It may be Stoic, but it's sort of interesting to me, the religious religious imperative that's embodied here. And the reason why I'm sort of struck by it is it's so contemporary. There's a book just out by a conservative Christian writer named Rod Dreher called Live Not by Lies. And the very core of the book, it focuses on Catholic resistance to communist oppression in Eastern Europe. And this speech here could have been in that book. I've read excerpts from it, not the whole book, for why it is that underground Catholic priests in Slovakia would gladly go to prison for this kind of reasoning about commitment to their faith. So it struck me as a very contemporary kind of sense of religious obligation, founded in reason, founded in right reason, as they would say.
Yeah. And that argument, the argument that Dreher cites, this argument is actually very similar to modern Orthodox Jewish arguments for keeping the Torah. So people may have heard the name Joseph Soloveitchik before, maybe not. So he wrote a book called Halachic Man. And this is part of his argument in Halachic Man, is that of all these laws make us better people anyway. They make us more religious man, more reasonable man, more rational man, more whatever, their hallmarks of being a civilized person. Joseph Soloveitchik, for people who are not familiar with him, in the modern Orthodox world, if you were to walk into Ohev Sholom on 16th Street Northwest, and you were talking to somebody there and you said, "Oh, I was reading the Rav," they would know who you were talking about because it's Joseph Soloveitchik. And this is something he would write too. So it's part and parcel of keeping kosher that people make these kinds of arguments. So yeah, it's not surprising that Slovakian priests said the same thing. Totally believable. Also totally believable that somebody like Rod Dreher would cite it. But, if you know who Rod Dreher is, that's not all that surprising, I guess. And then the book, I have to explain the milk thing. So we got to do a little bit of the Book of Judith. So the Book of Judith tells the story of Holofernes, who's a Babylonian general. The book calls the Babylonians Assyrians, so they don't really know their history in this book. Judith decides to seduce Holofernes in an effort to kill him, which she accomplishes. So he tries to seduce her. She says, "Oh, I can teach you how to defeat the Israelites and you don't have to worry about it." And then he gets drunk and she cuts his head off. The story in its plot is very similar to part of the Book of Judges chapter 4, where Yael, who is a Canaanite prostitute, not even really a Jewish woman according to the story, kills the Canaanite general Sisera, who had been bothering the Israelites. And she basically sees him at the side of the road and says, "Here, come into my tent, I'll give you shelter." Feeds him a bunch of cheese, which is salty, so he gets thirsty, so he drinks a bunch of wine and passes out, and she then puts a tent post through his head. The rabbis get all confused by all of this and start to read it together. They conflate the story of Yael with the story of Judith and say that Judith made all kinds of cheesecakes for Holofernes and killed him, but that Holofernes was working for Antiochus. So they misplaced him by 400 odd years from the original story. And we get a medieval book, the Scroll of Judith, which is not the same as the Book of Judith, that mixes these two together and starts to be read in synagogues in the medieval period. And that's the got milk, is cheese is actually really important as a food, not only for Shavuot, but for Hanukkah. So this is why, one, people eat blintzes on Hanukkah sometimes, and two, why medieval and modern Jewish legal codes say that women get the night off on Hanukkah, is because of Judith. Is because the rabbis got Judith and Yael confused and misplaced in time, and now they're willing to give women the night off. Thank you very much, rabbis, for being willing to cut somebody some slack sometime, I guess. So that is the breathtaking version of running through 1st, 2nd, 4th Maccabees and the Book of Judith and the Scroll of Judith. So it's 9 o'clock, so I don't want to keep anybody, but if people have questions, I'm happy to answer questions.